Berlin, May 1, 1945. The Third Reich is dying in its capital. Soviet artillery pounds the city into rubble. The Reichstag burns. Hitler is dead in his bunker beneath the Chancellery, his body being consumed by flames in a shell crater outside. The war in Europe has mere days left, but the killing continues with desperate ferocity. German soldiers fight from street to street, building to building, knowing they've already lost but fighting anyway. Among the Soviet officers coordinating the final assault is Major Alexei Dmitrievich Karpov, an NKVD intelligence officer attached to the 1st Belarusian Front. He isn't leading infantry charges or directing tank columns. His war is fought in occupied buildings, in interrogation rooms, in the systematic processing of captured documents and prisoners. His task is to locate and secure Nazi intelligence files, to identify war criminals, to ensure that valuable information doesn't disappear in the chaos of collapse. Karpov is 34 years old, a veteran of the intelligence services since before the war. He speaks fluent German, having studied in Berlin in the 1930s before returning to Moscow ahead of the purges. He understands how the German mind works, how their bureaucracy functions, where they hide their secrets. Documents later declassified from Soviet archives describe him as methodical, intelligent, politically reliable, and utterly ruthless when necessary. In the final days of the battle for Berlin, as Soviet forces tighten their grip on the government quarter, Karpov is reportedly seen entering the Reich Main Security Office headquarters, the nerve center of Nazi intelligence operations. He emerges hours later with several crates of documents, files that are immediately classified at the highest level and shipped directly to Moscow under armed guard. What those files contained has never been fully revealed. Fragments released decades later hint at intelligence networks, at Nazi operations that extended far beyond Germany's borders, at plans for a post-war resistance movement, at hidden caches of looted wealth and art. The kind of information that could be valuable to whoever possessed it, that could be leveraged for political advantage or personal gain. And then, on May 8, 1945, the day Germany officially surrendered, the day the war in Europe officially ended, Major Alexei Karpov vanished. No transfer orders, no travel documents, no communication with his command structure. One moment he was at his desk in the Soviet Military Administration building in Berlin, processing prisoners and documents. The next moment he was gone, as if he had simply evaporated into the smoke and chaos that still hung over the ruined city. The NKVD searched for him immediately. An intelligence officer disappearing with access to highly classified materials was a security breach of the highest order. Roadblocks were established. Border posts were alerted. His photograph was circulated to occupation forces across Soviet-controlled Germany. Rewards were offered for information. They found nothing. No body. No witnesses. No trace of him in any of the prisoner camps or displaced persons centers. No border crossings recorded under his name or any known alias. Major Alexei Dmitrievich Karpov had disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him. For decades, his name would appear in NKVD and later KGB files as an unresolved case, a traitor who had defected to the West with Soviet secrets, or possibly a victim of German resistance fighters in the final chaotic days. But the truth, the real story of where Alexei Karpov went when he vanished from Berlin, would remain hidden for 71 years, buried in a place no one thought to look, waiting for time and chance to reveal it. May 7th, 1945. The last day. The details of Karpov's final day in Berlin can be partially reconstructed from fragmentary records, from witness statements collected during the initial investigation, from the meticulous record-keeping that characterized Soviet military administration, even in the chaos of victory. He reported to his office in the morning as usual, signed for documents, conducted interrogations of captured German officers, had lunch in the officers' mess where he sat alone as was his habit, reading a book while eating, returned to his office in the afternoon. At approximately 16:30 hours, he told his assistant, a junior lieutenant named Viktor Sokolov, that he was going to inspect a warehouse where captured documents were being stored. This was routine. Karpov frequently conducted such inspections, ensuring that valuable materials weren't being lost or damaged in the confusion. Sokolov offered to accompany him. Karpov declined, saying it was a brief inspection and he would return within the hour. He left the building carrying a leather briefcase and wearing his service uniform. Several soldiers saw him walk down the street, heading in the direction of the warehouse district. After that, nothing. When Karpov didn't return by 19:00 hours, Sokolov became concerned and reported it to their commanding officer. A search was initiated immediately. The warehouse Karpov had mentioned was located and searched thoroughly. No sign of him. No indication he'd ever arrived. Expanded searches over the following days covered the entire Soviet sector of Berlin. Every building where Karpov might have gone was checked. Every German civilian in the area was questioned. Every Soviet soldier was interviewed. The investigation was exhaustive, conducted with the full weight of NKVD resources. They discovered several troubling facts. Karpov's quarters had been thoroughly cleaned out. Personal effects were gone. Photographs, letters, his spare uniform, everything. As if he had prepared for a departure. His service pistol was missing. So was the briefcase he'd been carrying. More significantly, a clerk in the document processing center reported that Karpov had signed out several files the day before his disappearance. Files relating to Nazi intelligence operations in neutral countries. When investigators checked, the files had been returned, but the clerk couldn't swear that they were complete. Pages might have been removed, copied, photographed. A financial investigation revealed that Karpov had been converting his salary into gold and Swiss francs for months. Using black market dealers who operated in the ruins of Berlin, he'd accumulated a substantial amount of hard currency, unusual for a Soviet officer who should have been sending his pay home to family. The pattern was clear. This wasn't a sudden disappearance, it was planned, premeditated. Karpov had been preparing to vanish for months, possibly since before the war even ended. The question was where he'd gone and what he'd taken with him. Western intelligence agencies were immediately suspected. The Americans and British were competing with the Soviets for Nazi intelligence assets, for scientists and spies and documents. Perhaps Karpov had been recruited. Perhaps he'd sold information in exchange for extraction and a new life in the West. But interrogations of captured Western agents produced nothing. Defector debriefings in later years never mentioned Karpov. If he'd gone west, he'd covered his tracks perfectly. Or perhaps he hadn't gone west at all. Perhaps he'd gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere no one was looking. Because Alexei Karpov understood something that his pursuers didn't. In the chaos of 1945 Europe, with millions of displaced persons moving across borders, with documentation systems collapsed, with entire populations in flux, a man could disappear. Not by running to America or Britain where he'd always be watched, always be vulnerable to Soviet revenge, but by becoming someone else entirely, by hiding in plain sight in a place where no one would think to look for a Soviet intelligence officer. He went south, into the mountains, into neutral territory, into Switzerland, where the war had never officially arrived, where banks kept secrets and mountain villages asked no questions, where a man with money and determination could simply cease to exist. The Swiss Alps, 1945 to 1960. Switzerland in 1945 was flooded with refugees, with people trying to escape the ruins of Europe, to find safety before borders hardened and the Iron Curtain descended. The Swiss authorities were overwhelmed, processing thousands of cases, trying to distinguish between genuine refugees and war criminals, between victims and perpetrators. In this chaos, a man with forged documents and a convincing story could disappear, especially if that man understood intelligence tradecraft, if he knew how to create a false identity that would withstand scrutiny, if he had the money to bribe officials and the patience to wait out suspicion. According to fragmentary records discovered much later in Swiss immigration archives, a man identifying himself as Anton Richter, an Austrian businessman whose documents had been lost in the bombing of Vienna, entered Switzerland in late May 1945. He claimed to be fleeing Soviet occupation, a story that resonated with Swiss authorities sympathetic to anti-communist refugees. He had money, he caused no trouble, and his German was native-level fluent. He was granted temporary residency while his case was processed. Anton Richter settled in the Graubünden region, a mountainous area in eastern Switzerland known for its isolation and independence. He rented a small apartment in the village of Davos, a ski resort that was quiet in summer, populated mainly by locals and a few year-round residents. He kept to himself, was polite but not friendly, paid his rent on time, and gradually became part of the background of village life. Over the following years, Anton Richter established himself as a modestly successful translator, working by mail with publishing houses in Zurich and Basel, translating Russian and German texts. It was solitary work that explained why he rarely socialized, why he preferred to stay in his apartment with his books and papers, why he seemed content to live alone. The villagers accepted him. Switzerland had many such men, refugees from the war who had come to the mountains seeking peace and were content to be left alone. Some suspected he was running from something, but that was his business. The Swiss tradition of privacy protected men like Anton Richter. But Anton Richter was merely a facade, a role being played. Inside that modest apartment, Alexei Karpov continued to exist, though he never spoke his real name aloud, never wrote it down, never acknowledged the person he had been. He had documents stored in a bank vault in Zurich, insurance against discovery, copies of the files he'd taken from Berlin, materials that could be traded for protection if necessary. He learned to live with constant vigilance. Every knock on the door might be Soviet agents. Every stranger in the village might be an assassin. Every unusual event might signal that he'd been discovered. He slept lightly, kept a pistol within reach, maintained multiple escape routes from his apartment. But months passed into years, and no one came. The Soviets had either given up searching or assumed he was dead. His new identity held. He began to relax fractionally, to believe that perhaps he had actually escaped. In 1952, he made a decision that changed everything. He purchased property, a small plot of land in a remote valley accessible only by a difficult hiking trail, far from any village, far from any road. On that land, over the course of several years, he built a safe house, a hidden refuge where he could retreat if his cover was ever compromised, where he could survive indefinitely if necessary. The construction was slow, careful, designed to attract no attention. He hired no contractors. He did all the work himself, carrying materials up the mountain trail in small loads over many trips, working only in summer when hikers might explain his presence, building according to a plan that existed only in his mind. The result was a small but sophisticated mountain shelter, built into the landscape itself, camouflaged so perfectly that even experienced hikers passing within 50 meters wouldn't notice it. A place where Alexei Karpov could disappear completely if the past ever caught up with him. He stocked it with supplies, non-perishable food, water filtration equipment, medical supplies, warm clothing, books, and most importantly, documents. Everything he'd taken from Berlin, carefully preserved, his insurance policy and his burden, the evidence of crimes committed and secrets kept, materials that would guarantee his death if discovered, but might also guarantee his survival if properly leveraged. By 1955, the Safehouse was complete, a secret within a secret, a hiding place for a man who was already hiding. And for the next decade, Karpov lived his double life. Anton Richter in the village below, Alexei Karpov in the Safehouse above, moving between identities as needed, always careful, always watching, always prepared to run. The 1960s to 2010s, a life in shadows. Anton Richter lived in Davos for 32 years, from 1945 to 1977. During that time, he became a familiar, if somewhat enigmatic figure in the village. The quiet translator who kept to himself. The man who took long walks in the mountains regardless of weather. The bachelor who seemed content with his books and solitude. He aged gracefully, his hair going gray, his face developing the deep lines characteristic of mountain people who spend their lives in wind and sun. He developed a reputation for being knowledgeable about local history, about mountain trails, about the plants and animals of the high country. People grew accustomed to him. He was part of the landscape. But beneath the surface, Alexei Karpov never stopped being an intelligence officer. He monitored world events obsessively, reading multiple newspapers daily, listening to radio broadcasts in several languages. He tracked Soviet activities in Europe, watched for any indication that they were still searching for him, maintained his readiness to disappear if necessary. The Safehouse became his sanctuary, a place he visited several times each year, always careful to vary his route and timing, always checking for any indication that he'd been followed. He kept it maintained, replaced supplies as they expired, updated his documents, ensured that it would be ready if he ever needed it. In his private journals discovered much later, he wrote extensively about his isolation, about the psychological burden of living a lie, about the loneliness of having no one who knew his real name or history. But he also wrote about freedom, about having escaped the Soviet system, about living on his own terms rather than dying in a Lubyanka basement. One entry from 1968 read, 23 years since I left Berlin, 23 years of looking over my shoulder, 23 years of being someone I'm not. Was it worth it? Yes. 1,000 times yes. I am alive. I am free. I choose my own path. That is worth any price. Another from 1974. Growing old. My hands shake sometimes. My vision is failing. I wonder what will happen when I can no longer maintain 2 lives, when I can no longer climb to the safe house, when age makes me vulnerable. But I cannot go back. Can never go back. This is my fate. To die here as Anton Richter, taking Alexei Karpov to the grave with me. In 1977, Anton Richter's health began to decline noticeably. He developed a persistent cough that doctors in Chur diagnosed as chronic bronchitis, common in elderly mountain residents. He continued working as long as he could, but the isolation that had protected him for decades now became a burden. He had no family, no close friends, no one to care for him as his health failed. In March 1978, Anton Richter died quietly in his sleep in his apartment in Davos. He was 67 years old. The local priest conducted a simple funeral. A handful of villagers attended, out of respect for a neighbor even if not a friend. He was buried in the village cemetery under the name Anton Richter, Austrian refugee. No one suspected that the man in that coffin was actually a Soviet intelligence officer who had been missing for 33 years. His apartment was cleared by the landlord. A few books, some old clothes, papers that meant nothing to anyone. No one came forward to claim his effects. His bank accounts in Zurich, under various false names, remained untouched. The documents hidden in his safety deposit boxes remained sealed. And far above the village, in a hidden valley accessible only by a difficult mountain trail, the safe house remained, sealed, forgotten, slowly being reclaimed by the mountain, its location known only to a dead man. For decades it sat there, through summers and winters, through storms and clear days. The forest grew closer, snow accumulated on the roof and melted and accumulated again. The door sealed itself with rust and time. Inside, protected from the elements, everything waited. Documents, supplies, evidence of a life lived in secret. A time capsule from the Cold War, hidden so well that no one knew it existed. Until climate change and a freak landslide exposed something that had been hidden for 3/4 of a century. Until hikers stumbled upon a door that shouldn't exist. Until the past returned to interrupt the present. July 2016, the discovery. Climate change has affected the Alps dramatically. Glaciers that seemed eternal are melting. Permafrost that held slopes stable for millennia is thawing. Landslides and rockfalls are becoming more common as the mountains adjust to new conditions. The landscape is changing in ways that reveal what was hidden. In July 2016, a severe storm passed through the Graubünden region, dropping record rainfall in a short period. The water-saturated soil on steep slopes became unstable. Several landslides were reported, blocking hiking trails, damaging mountain huts, changing the topography in dramatic ways. 2 Swiss hikers, Thomas Weber and his wife Elena, were exploring a remote valley known for its wildflowers when they noticed something unusual. A recent landslide had exposed a section of mountainside that had previously been covered by forest and accumulated soil. And visible in the newly exposed earth was something that looked artificial. A straight edge, metal that had been rusted but was clearly manufactured. A door frame. They approached carefully, aware of the dangers of unstable slopes and curious about what they'd found. As they cleared away loose debris, they realized this wasn't a natural cave or an old mining shaft. This was a structure that had been deliberately built and then concealed. A door set into a facade that mimicked the surrounding rock. A hidden entrance that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. The door was locked and sealed, rust and corrosion making it nearly immovable. But through gaps around the frame, they could see that it led to an interior space, a room or tunnel that extended back into the mountain. They took photographs and marked the GPS coordinates. Back in the village, they reported their discovery to the local authorities, who initially assumed it might be a military installation from World War II. Switzerland had built numerous fortifications in the mountains, camouflaged bunkers, and hidden gun positions designed to make any invasion prohibitively costly. Perhaps this was one of those forgotten defensive positions. But when military historians examined the site, they realized something was wrong. The construction style didn't match Swiss military engineering. The materials were wrong for the 1940s. And most puzzling, there were no records of any fortification in this location. Whatever this structure was, it wasn't official. Within a month, a formal excavation team was assembled. Archaeologists, structural engineers, historical preservation specialists. The door was carefully opened, revealing what had been hidden for 71 years. Not a military bunker, a safe house, a refuge built with obvious skill and considerable effort, designed for long-term survival in isolation. And inside, preserved by the dry mountain air and the sealed environment, was evidence of who had built it and why. The main chamber was approximately 4 meters by 5 meters, carved into solid rock and reinforced with concrete. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies that were decades old but still recognizable. Canned food with labels in German and French. Medical supplies from the 1950s, clothing, blankets, books in multiple languages, and in a sealed metal cabinet, protected from moisture and pests, were documents, hundreds of pages, files marked with Nazi insignia, NKVD reports in Russian, personal papers, photographs, identity documents in multiple names, and journals, several leather-bound notebooks filled with dense handwriting in Russian. The journals identified the owner, Major Alexei Dmitrievich Karpov, NKVD, missing since May 1945. The man who had vanished from Berlin at the end of the war had been living in Switzerland in plain sight, under a false identity for 33 years, and he had built this safe house as his ultimate refuge, a place where he could disappear if his cover was ever compromised. After 71 years, the mystery of Karpov's disappearance had been solved, but what was found in that hidden room, what secrets he had preserved and why, would prove to be even more significant than finding him. The safe house, a treasure of secrets. The excavation and documentation of Karpov's safe house took nearly 6 months. Every item had to be carefully removed, catalogued, preserved, and analyzed. The Swiss government classified the entire operation at a high level, recognizing that the materials might contain information relevant to ongoing security concerns or diplomatic relations. The structure itself was a masterpiece of concealment and survival engineering. Karpov had built it entirely by hand, using materials that wouldn't attract attention, camouflaging it so perfectly that it had remained undiscovered for over 7 decades despite being relatively close to established hiking trails. The interior showed evidence of meticulous planning, a ventilation system that drew air through concealed channels, preventing carbon monoxide buildup while keeping the entrance sealed, a water collection system that captured condensation and rain runoff, filtering it through natural charcoal and sand, storage systems designed to protect supplies from moisture and pests. But the most significant discoveries were the documents. Karpov had used this safe house as an archive, a place to store materials that would have been immediately incriminating if found in his village apartment. What he had preserved was a snapshot of Nazi and Soviet intelligence operations at the end of World War II, materials that had been assumed lost or destroyed. The Nazi files related to intelligence networks in neutral countries, particularly Switzerland, Portugal, and Spain. They detailed agents, informants, communication methods, and covert operations. Some of these networks had continued operating after the war, their assets recruited by Western intelligence services or Soviet intelligence, depending on who reached them first. Karpov's documents provided evidence of these continuities, showing how Nazi intelligence structures had been absorbed rather than dismantled. The Soviet files were equally revealing. Reports on looted art and gold that had been recovered by Soviet forces but never officially reported. Intelligence assessments of Western intentions in the immediate post-war period. Files on Soviet agents operating in Western countries. And most significantly, evidence of NKVD operations to eliminate Soviet citizens who had collaborated with the Germans. Operations that continued well into the 1950s, targeting people living in displaced persons camps or under new identities in Western countries. These were the materials that had made Karpov valuable and dangerous. Knowledge that could be leveraged for protection or profit. Evidence that multiple governments would have wanted suppressed. His insurance policy for survival and his death sentence if discovered. Among the personal papers were documents explaining how Karpov had created his Anton Richter identity. He'd started with papers belonging to an actual Austrian businessman who had died in the bombing of Vienna, then progressively built layers of documentation, establishing a history that could withstand official scrutiny. The tradecraft was professional, showing his NKVD training, but also creative in ways that suggested genuine desperation and determination. The photographs were perhaps the most humanizing discoveries. Images of a woman and young child, carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. On the back, in faded ink, Natasha and Misha, 1939. His wife and son, presumably. People he'd left behind when he vanished, who had almost certainly been punished for his defection, who might have spent years in labor camps or internal exile because of his choice. One photograph showed Karpov himself, in civilian clothes, young and serious, standing in what looked like Moscow before the war. On the back, Alexei, 1937, the man he had been, the identity he had sacrificed to survive. The journals, a life in exile. The journals found in the Safehouse were extensive, covering the period from 1945 to 1977. They were written in Russian, in code that took specialists months to fully decipher, in a compact script that filled every page. They represented Karpov's attempt to preserve his real identity, even as he lived as someone else. A place where Alexei could exist, even though Anton had to be the public face. The early entries, from 1945 and 1946, detailed his escape and the immediate challenges of establishing a false identity. He wrote about the constant fear of discovery, about learning to think and act as Anton Richter rather than Alexei Karpov, about the psychological burden of maintaining a deception every waking moment. One entry from August 1945 read, 3 months since I left Berlin. 3 months of being Anton. Sometimes I almost forget who I really am. I catch myself thinking in German first, responding to the name Richter automatically. This is necessary for survival, but frightening. What happens if I completely become Anton? If Alexei disappears not just externally but internally? Do I cease to exist even in my own mind? Another from December 1946. Winter in the mountains. Bitter cold. But nothing compared to the cold in my heart. I wonder about Natasha. About Misha. They must have been arrested, interrogated, punished for my crimes. My son would be 7 now. Is he in an orphanage, being raised to hate his traitor father? Or did they kill them both efficiently to erase my line completely? I will never know. This is the price. I tell myself it was worth it, that my survival justifies their suffering. But I don't believe it. Some nights I wish I had stayed. Faced the execution. At least then my family would have been spared. The middle years from the 1950s through the 1970s showed Karpov adjusting to his new life. The entries became less frequent, but more reflective. He wrote about world events, analyzing the Cold War from his isolated perspective, commenting on decisions made in Moscow and Washington with the insight of someone who understood intelligence operations from the inside. One entry from 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis read, "Watched the world come to the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy and Khrushchev playing chess with human civilization. From here, safe in my Swiss hiding place, it seems absurd. All the ideology, the posturing, the threats. For what? Power. Control. Neither side willing to back down until both realized they had gone too far. I helped build this world. I provided intelligence that strengthened Soviet capabilities. And now I watch, helpless, as the system I served nearly destroys everything. What have we done?" Another from 1975. 30 years since Berlin. 30 years of exile. 30 years of being someone else. I am 64 years old. An old man. Anton Richter has lived longer than Alexei Karpov ever did. He is more real now than the person I was born as. Sometimes I look in the mirror and see a stranger. Who am I really? The Soviet officer who betrayed his country? Or the Swiss translator who lives quietly in the mountains? Perhaps neither. Perhaps both. Perhaps identity is more fluid than we admit, shaped by circumstances and choices rather than being some fixed essence. The final entries from 1977 showed a man facing mortality and reflecting on the choices that had defined his life. He wrote about regrets, about things he would have done differently, but also about satisfaction at having lived on his own terms, rather than dying as the state intended. The last entry was dated March 10, 1978, 5 days before he died. The handwriting was shakier than in earlier entries showing the effects of age and illness. I am dying. The doctors don't say it directly, but I know. The cough that won't stop, the weight loss, the exhaustion, lung cancer probably. From too many cigarettes over too many years, ironic. I escaped execution only to die of disease. But I am 67. I have outlived most of my generation, especially those who stayed in Soviet service. I have lived free, if lonely. I have made my own choices, right or wrong. That is more than most people can say. This safe house has been my sanctuary, the only place where I could be Alexei without fear, where the documents I took are preserved, evidence of crimes and secrets that governments wanted buried. I wonder if anyone will ever find this place. If they do, they will know the truth. Major Alexei Karpov did not die in 1945. He lived for another 33 years, under a different name in a different country as a different person. But he lived. To whoever reads this, I was a traitor to my country. I stole classified documents. I vanished at the moment I was most needed, when the war ended and the real work of building peace should have begun. I chose survival over duty, personal freedom over collective obligation. The Soviet system would call me a criminal. The West might call me a defector or hero. I am neither. I am simply a man who decided his life was his own, not the property of the state, who refused to die for someone else's ideology. I regret the people I hurt, my wife, my son, comrades who were questioned because of my disappearance. But I don't regret surviving. Life is precious. Freedom is precious. I chose both, and I would choose them again. My name is Alexei Dmitrievich Karpov. I was born in Moscow in 1911. I served in Soviet intelligence. I vanished in 1945. I lived as Anton Richter until 1978. I was here. I existed. That is my testament. The journal ended there. 5 days later, Anton Richter died in his apartment in Davos. Alexei Karpov died with him. His real identity preserved only in documents hidden in a mountain safe house that wouldn't be discovered for another 38 years. The aftermath, secrets and scandals. The discovery of Karpov's safe house created immediate diplomatic complications. The documents he had preserved implicated multiple governments in activities they had long denied. Nazi intelligence networks absorbed by Western powers. Soviet assassination programs targeting refugees. Looted wealth that had disappeared into Swiss bank accounts. Collaborative relationships between former enemies when it served mutual interests. The Swiss government initially classified everything, citing national security concerns. But leaks were inevitable. Journalists obtained photographs. Researchers demanded access. Family members of people mentioned in the documents filed legal requests for information. Within 2 years, a sanitized version of the Karpov archive was released, with sensitive portions redacted. Even in redacted form, it caused scandals in multiple countries. German officials were forced to address questions about continuities between Nazi and post-war intelligence. Russian historians gained new insights into NKVD operations. Swiss authorities faced uncomfortable questions about how a Soviet defector had lived undetected in Switzerland for over 3 decades. But the most profound impact was personal. DNA testing confirmed Karpov's identity, comparing samples from the safe house with material in Russian archives. More significantly, it connected him to living descendants. His son Mikhail, who Karpov had last seen as a 4-year-old, had survived. He hadn't been executed. He'd been sent to an orphanage, raised under a different name, never told about his father except that he was a traitor who had betrayed the motherland. Mikhail had lived his entire life under that shadow, the son of a defector, always watched, always suspected, denied opportunities because of his father's crimes. Mikhail was 80 years old when he learned what had really happened, that his father had lived in Switzerland, that he had built a safe house, that he had written about regretting abandoning his family, but believing survival was worth any cost. In an interview with a Russian newspaper, Mikhail said, "I hated him my entire life. I was taught to hate him. The state told me he was a traitor, a coward who ran away when he was needed most. I believed it. What else could I believe? I was 4 years old when he vanished. I have no memory of him. Just the absence. Just the shame. Now I learn he survived. He lived in Switzerland for 33 years. He died an old man while I was in my 30s, and I never knew he was alive. Part of me is angry. He abandoned us. My mother died in a labor camp. I was raised in institutions, all because of his choice to save himself. But another part understands. Stalin would have killed him. The NKVD would have tortured him in a basement and put a bullet in his head and erased him from history. He refused to accept that fate. He chose life over death. Can I blame him? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I wish he had tried to contact me, even once, even a letter to say he was alive, that he thought about me, but he couldn't. Any contact would have endangered both of us. So he lived alone and died alone, and I lived thinking he was long dead. Two lives shaped by one choice made in Berlin in 1945. He was my father. I never knew him. Now I know too much and still not enough. That is his legacy. Questions without answers. Secrets that outlived him. Epilogue. The weight of choice. Snow falls softly now over the mountains of Graubünden, covering the landscape in white. The Safehouse has been sealed again, preserved as a historical site but closed to the public. Only researchers with special authorization can access it, can examine the documents, can walk through the small room where Alexei Karpov kept his secrets for over 7 decades. In Davos, a small plaque now marks the building where Anton Richter lived for 32 years. It identifies him by both names, acknowledging the duality of his existence. Anton Richter, Alexei Dmitrievich Karpov, 1911-1978. Soviet officer, translator. A life lived in 2 identities. A reminder that history is personal before it is political. The documents from the Safehouse are divided between archives in Switzerland, Russia, and Germany. Researchers continue analyzing them, uncovering new details about intelligence operations, about the immediate post-war period, about how the Cold War began not in 1947 but in 1945, in occupied Berlin, when former allies began competing for Nazi secrets and Soviet officers started defecting. But beyond the documents and historical significance, what remains is the human story. A man who chose survival over duty, who lived 33 years under a false name, never able to be himself except in a hidden room in a mountain, who died believing no one would ever know the truth, who left behind a son who learned too late that his father had been alive, had been thinking of him, had been regretting but not reversing his choice. Was Karpov a traitor or a survivor? A coward or someone brave enough to reject the system that would have destroyed him? The answer probably depends on who you ask, on what you believe about duty and freedom, about personal obligation versus individual rights, about whether any state has the right to own a person's life. What's certain is that he made a choice. In May 1945, facing the probability of execution for knowing too much, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, for being expendable in the great machine of Soviet power, Alexei Karpov said no. He walked away. He became someone else. He lived. The cost was enormous. A family destroyed. A life lived in constant fear. Decades of isolation and loneliness. The inability to ever be fully himself. But he lived. On his terms. Making his own choices. Free in ways that most Soviet citizens could never imagine. The Safehouse stands empty now. Its contents removed to archives and museums. But it remains as evidence. Proof that one man, facing impossible choices, found a third option. Survival, concealment, patience, building a hiding place so perfect that it remained hidden for 71 years after his death. The mountains keep their secrets. The snow covers evidence. Time erases memory, but not completely, not forever. Eventually, someone stumbles upon a door that shouldn't exist. Eventually, the hidden becomes visible. Eventually, the truth emerges. Uncomfortable and complex and human. Alexei Karpov vanished at the end of the war, but he didn't die. He transformed, hiding in plain sight, waiting out the regime that wanted him dead, outliving his enemies, dying naturally in a Swiss mountain village as an old man rather than in a Moscow basement as a young officer. His Safehouse was found. His story was revealed. His son learned the truth decades too late, and now we remember. Not a simple story of heroism or villainy, but a complicated story of survival, of the choices people make when facing impossible circumstances, of the price of freedom and the burden of secrets. He was here. He lived 2 lives. He died alone. And 71 years later, his hidden refuge was found, preserving the evidence of a life lived on the edge between 2 identities, between 2 worlds, between survival and truth. That is his legacy. Not resolution, but complication. Not answers, but more questions. The reminder that behind every historical event are human stories, messy and morally ambiguous and profoundly human. The Safehouse remembers, the mountains remember, and now, finally, we remember too.